Okay.
Maybe before you were born.
I wouldn't just say maybe. Anyway, let's not. Age is, very subjective. And talking about subjective. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start, because there's a lot of content to get through, and hopefully you'll find it enriching. Okay? So this is the first of a series, but each session is a standalone session. It's independent. As mentioned before, my name is Johnny. I'm originally from London. I now live a little bit further south, near a place called Kiryat Gat. I like to teach, I like to learn, and this topic of Shehecheyanu is a personal passion of mine, and truth be told, I'm using you as critical friends. I hope at some point in time to develop what we're talking about tonight as a book. So I'm relying on you to tell me if I'm making mistakes, if I've misunderstood things, if my judgment is slightly off the radar. So I'm going to need you to help me explore some of these ideas. I prepare what I can, and let's start off. So we know there's a bracha called Shehecheyanu, right? We're familiar with that bracha. At some point or another, we probably said it. When do we most likely say Shehecheyanu? When do we hear it? Or when do we say it more often than not? On Yom Tov, on festivals, right? So, is there any other times we say Shehecheyanu? We say on Yom Tov, right? On Pesach and Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah and all those kind of things. When else? You mentioned before, you've done some shopping. That's right. So when you buy new items, that's a headline for today's session. When you buy something new, and we're not yet going to define what that is, but let's simply say you buy something fancy. You buy a lovely piece of jewelry, a new car, right? A washing machine, a refrigerator, right? Many people would say Shehecheyanu on those kind of occasions.
Do you have to use it first?
Good question. We're going to talk about it right today. But that's two types of Shehecheyanu. But there's actually even more than two types of Shehecheyanu. What do people do on Rosh Hashanah? Round about the table, we often have different fruits, right? There's a custom to have different fruits, new fruits on Rosh Hashanah, and we use that as an excuse to say Shehecheyanu. How about if I told you just won the lottery? Well, you're thinking, well, I wouldn't be here now. I'll be out spending money and saying Shehecheyanu, right? But if I told you just won the lottery, right? Would you say Shehecheyanu?
I'd say Baruch Hashem.
Say Baruch Hashem. The truth is, saying Baruch Hashem is a beautiful thing, but you can say, whether you say can or should, but you certainly can say Shehecheyanu on good news, because what we often remember is, sadly, when we encounter tough times, we say Dayana Emes. Sadly, we bury somebody, we say that blessing. In fact, you'd say that blessing if you undergo other tragedies. I was just looking today at the videos of some of the families in Houston, right? And they've really gone through tremendous turmoil. They'd say Dayana Emes. I'm not saying they have to, because they've had a terrible loss. Lehefech, conversely, you say Shehecheyanu on wonderful news. I give winning the lottery as an example. Sorry.
Well, winning the lottery, you made a mistake. I told you before the whole dollars.
Oh, okay. So think about a wonderful moment, though. Perhaps you'd say that bracha. So in fact, there are 5 different times when you're going to say Shehecheyanu. And it's important to know this, because one of the things about Shehecheyanu is it's very, very misunderstood. So we say Shehecheyanu on the Jewish festivals, on the holidays, right? We mentioned that beforehand. We say Shehecheyanu performing certain rare mitzvot. You know, if you do a mitzvah, you haven't done it before, you may well say Shehecheyanu. It could be for perhaps the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, or putting on, there's a debate whether a kala, a bride, says Shehecheyanu when she lights candles for the first time. Even though there's debate, let's simply say that in certain mitzvahs, you're going to say Shehecheyanu. The third is a new fruits thing. The fourth is when you buy new items. And the fifth is when you hear fabulous news that relates to you. Now, once we appreciate that there are numerous contexts in which Shehecheyanu can be recited, and by the way, what's interesting is many frum people aren't aware of this. They'll refer to the Shehecheyanu on the holidays. They may know that you're supposed to say Shehecheyanu when you buy new things. But if you had probed them, most people wouldn't associate Shehecheyanu with hearing good news, even though, sadly, when you hear bad news, the first things we blurt out is Baruch Deine Emes. We forget that there is a flip side to that blessing, and that is Shehecheyanu. But even though there are 5 different Shecheyanus, we can certainly identify themes and similarities between some of these cases, such that there are really 2 main headlines, 2 particular sugim, categories of Shehecheyanu. So there are 5 examples. I'll go back to that if you like. There are 5 examples of Shehecheyanu. If you were talking about before, there you have it there. And there are 2 categories. One is Birkat Hazman, a blessing said on time-oriented events. And the other is Birkat HaShevach B'Hodah, a blessing on joyful moments. So if I'd say Birkat Hazman is that the kind of Shehecheyanu you say when you get a new item? You'd say no, that's like the festival one. That's when you thank God for this cycle to have come around, right? Whereas if you hear good news, or if you buy a new thing, then you're going to say this type of Shehecheyanu. Of course, what's profoundly confusing is the fact that the blessing is utterly identical, right? So you have a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Shehecheyanu kiman v'yanu lazman hazeh. And yet, while that can be expressed in lots of different contexts, in fact, there are 2 different spheres, 2 different categories where this blessing is recited. One, time-bound, and one, perhaps you could say, joy-bound or celebratory-bound. Who cares? Meaning, that's all very nice. Why am I telling you this? Well, actually, there are a whole bunch of reasons why you need to know these definitions, because the rules apply differently. Let's think about it. Birkat Hazman, the blessings of Shehecheyanu, which are related to time, means that I can't say the blessing when it's not the right time. Yeah? Whereas Birkat HaShevach B'Hoda'ah, right, the blessings on joy, means that I can only say the blessing, or I should say the blessing, when I'm feeling joyful. And it shouldn't be coordinated by an outside force. I can't plan to be happy next week. I know that if I'm joyful, I should say the blessing. One is fixed in the calendar or fixed according to a cycle. And one is set and rooted in a moment of exhilaration and celebration. So far, so good. Are there any questions about what I've said so far?
When you say a Torah,
so Hatov HaMeitiv, which we're going to get to in the 3rd session, is understood by most people as being Shehecheyanu to plural. Meaning, if you buy something, but it's not just for one person, it's for 2 or more, you say Hatov HaMeitiv. In many ways, much of what I've said applies to Hatov HaMeitiv, because all that is the plural version of Shehecheyanu. There is a debate, actually, exactly about the nature of Hatov HaMeitiv. Maybe there is a slightly more nuanced nature of that blessing as compared to Shehecheyanu. We're not there yet, though. So we have different times we say Shehecheyanu, 2 different categories, one rooted in time, one rooted in moments. And in fact, when the Gemara talks about this, the top one, it always calls it Birkat Hazman. And whenever it talks about the bottom one, the Shehecheyanu moments, it always says Birkat Shehecheyanu. Meaning the Gemara, even though it's talking about the same blessing, is deliberate to distinguish between these 2 categories because they matter. Now, having introduced this, I'd like to walk you through the sugya, the topic of purchasing new items. The laws pertaining to how, when, or if we should say Shehecheyanu on purchasing new items, which should certainly be under this category, and it is, right? It's a Birkat HaShevach B'Hoda'ah. Now, you have handouts in front of you which have source material. Almost all is translated. And what we're going to do is we're going to read it. Now, some of the sources are crystal clear. Some aren't. And the bits that aren't are, of course, going to be the subject of our conversation. So the first source comes from a Mishnah and Tractate Brachot. And it's very, very explicit. It says, Bana Bait Chadash, Vakana Kelim Chadashim. If you've bought a new house or you've purchased new items, Omer Baruch Shehecheyanu. You say the blessing of Shehecheyanu. Remember, it doesn't say Omer Birkat Hazman, because it's not a time-rooted blessing. It's a celebratory-rooted blessing. You buy the house, you build the house, you buy the item, say Shehecheyanu. Are there any questions about the simplicity or the clarity of that statement? What are vessels? Right, so kalim is the rabbinic term for utensils, things that you buy, be it furniture, be it clothes, be it refrigerators or washing machines. It's a very generalized term. Of course, the question may well be, are there any exceptions? But it's things you buy, really. It's generalized, and I presume it applies to maybe at least 70% of what's in my house. There are vessels, right? There are things, a computer or a couch or a kitchen item. So the rule is, if you buy a house or you buy new items, you should say Shehecheyanu. Now, there's a small aside. I've argued that this should mean that malls, shopping centers, should be some of the holiest places where people are constantly reciting Shehecheyanu. I kid you not. I mean, if we're supposed to be reciting these blessings when you buy them, okay, we'll discuss when should you say the blessing. Is it when you buy it or when you use it? But let's just take the Mishnah literally, when you buy it. Then, when you're at the checkout at Usher Odd or at one of these big stores, right? Then you should be saying the blessings non-stop. Regrettably, we don't see that. And I want to make it clear that whatever our conclusions from today, I believe that we are not just missing a trick, we're missing a dimension of our Jewish life. Because we don't invoke the name of God when we purchase new items, even though it's very clearly a rule. We'll discuss the details here. But I deeply believe that underpinning this law is a profound philosophy, which is that God belongs no less in the mall than in the synagogue or in the home. And our task as Jews is to not just identify, but acknowledge and express our connection to God wherever we are. So especially if you're buying things, surely we should be saying, Toda Rabba Kadosh Baruch Hu, thank you. The formula would be Shehecheyanu, or if you choose not to, you'd be saying something, whatever we're saying though, shopping isn't a secular act, because shopping provides us with an opportunity to say thank you to God. It's a perspective. And that's a perspective that Chazal invested and expressed very clearly in the earliest rabbinic writings. Now, I'll pause just for a second. Any questions about where we're at?
Have you ever done this in a store?
Sure.
And what has been the reaction?
The interesting thing is, the blessing isn't necessarily about getting others to react. I mean, this is a personal blessing. Of course, a person can choose to stand on a big platform and say, everybody listen, I'm about to say the bracha. You can say it quietly, but it's about that moment of connection between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and yourself. Not every blessing has to be shouted out loud, but not saying a blessing when we can and perhaps should is itself a diminishing of opportunity to cleave and connect with Hashem. So I've said loud but not screaming, but I don't think the point is necessarily about the performance blessing. It's about the nature of that blessing. Sorry.
So you would say when you buy the item.
So there's debate whether you say it when you buy or when you use it, or how long can you have to say the blessing, and most of the commentaries say as long as you're joyful about it, which will be a couple of days. So for certain things, it may well be in a wrapper. Imagine you buy a piece of clothing which is significant, but it's all wrapped up, you're not quite holding on to it, or you buy something which is in a big box. So you may well say, once in the kitchen or in the house, once I bought this painting, once it's on the wall, then I'm going to say, that makes complete sense. So for each item, a person can make their own choice, because their joy and their sense of delight may well be most expressed either in the mall or in home, or the moment they take a selfie with it, whatever the thing may be. So what we're going to see through our session is the tension between the perceived hard and fast rules of Shehecheyanu and the reality, which is not just they're fluid, but they are very much rooted in the individual's experience. Yeah.
So if you're in a shop and you're buying several items, I'm not talking of Oshua or something like that, but several larger items, do you say it for each item or just once?
You don't need to say it for each item, and you can say it once. It may well be that, as I said, you put them in storage, and over a period of time you use it, and at that moment, at each particular stage, you feel a sense of spiritual delight, and you choose to say Shehecheyanu individually, and you could do that. But what we'll see is the hard and fast rules are not so hard and aren't so fast, and in many ways, what we've lost touch with is our ability to make personal decisions about personal feelings which express a personal connection. What's happened to us, and I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it's good to indicate kind of direction, is that we've become a little bit too reliant on other people conducting our religious lifestyle, especially when it comes to things which are so highly personal and so clearly subjective. And we're going to see examples of this tonight. Now, so that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is very, very clear. And we now move on to a Gemara. Now, I think we've spent a little bit more time than planned chatting. So what I'm going to do is quickly summarize it. And you'll tell me if you're happy with my summary. The translation, of course, is here. So the Gemara in Brachot, commenting on that Mishnah, says, Bana bait chadash v'kana kelim chadashim. You built a new house or bought new vessels, etc. And here we encounter a debate between two Talmudic sages. Rav Huna said, Lo shanu ela she'ein lo kiyotze bahen, aval yesh lo kiyotze bahen, eino tzarich levorech. Now what is Rabbi Huna saying? He says the rule of Shehecheyanu only applies if you haven't got one of these things already. If you've already got one of these things, you don't say Shehecheyanu on the next one. So let's take a simple example. Imagine you have a refrigerator, and it's coming to Chag, and you realize you've got all the family coming over. There just ain't enough room in the freezer to put all the dishes. This year it's 3 days. Good Lord. It's a whole kind of a process to figure out how to deal with the catering. So you buy a second fridge. According to Rav Huna, you may have said Shehecheyanu on fridge A, but you don't get to say it on fridge B. You've got one already. According to Rav Huna, it's all about the thing. If you got the things, you get another thing. Big deal.
What if you got rid of the first one?
Okay, so we're going to see. This is what it discusses, right? So it says, but if you've got something similar, you don't say the bracha. Rav Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afilu yesh lo kayotze bahen tzarich levarech. He says, so just because you've got a fridge already doesn't mean you're not happy to get the second one. I presume you wanted to buy the second one, otherwise you wouldn't have stood in line for half an hour, right, in order to pay for this. Like in Israel, with your 27 tashlumin, you're going to pay for it till doomsday. If you didn't want it, you wouldn't have bought it. Since you want it and you bought it, surely you're happy enough. Surely you should say Shehecheyanu. Now, the Gemara then says, we infer from here that if you bought something and then you bought more, maybe you don't need to say the bracha. But some people say, there's a slightly different version of the debate, that according to Rav Huna, the rule applies only when you do not buy a second purchase, but if you do, you don't need to say it. Rabbi Yochanan says, even if you buy again, you must say. It's a slight variation. We're not going to quite go into that. But what we see from here is two schools of thought. Rav Huna is of the opinion that it's all about the thing. If you've got the thing, the item, the vessel, the fridge, the piece of jewelry, the couch, and you buy a second one, you don't say Shehecheyanu. And Rabbi Yochanan says, it doesn't matter how many objects you have, because it's about the personal joy. And if you're buying another one and you're happy to do so, and you want to say thank you to God, then you go. Right? So this debate, to use fancy Talmudic terminology, is about the centrality of the gavra, the individual, or the chefza, the object. Is Shehecheyanu about buying a new object, or is it about the person being delighted for having bought an object? Who is the star of the show? The item or the individual? Sorry?
The item.
So you'd think, but isn't it kind of like a chicken and the egg? The item makes you happy. Why are you saying Shehecheyanu? Is it because you're happy or because of the item?
Because I have the item.
Because precisely. It's this beautiful dance between the item which seems important in your eyes and your joy of having the item. Of course, without the item, there's no blessing. Without the joy, there's no blessing, right? Nobody's going to say Shehecheyanu when somebody, buys you the sweater that you hate, right? And you always swore blindly you'd never wear it again. And then somebody buys you. Nobody's saying Shehecheyanu. Here we're talking about things that you want. So there is a debate in the Gemara as to whether Shehecheyanu is driven by the item or by the person. And what's the bottom line? It's late. Talmud is a great thing to do, but not always at 8:30 at night when it's not so clear. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is, we rule like Rabbi Yochanan. We say that Shehecheyanu is something which is stimulated by the purchase of a thing, but its expression is a result of the individual feeling joyful for the thing. So far, so good? Now, I'm going to pause for a second. So, imagine I buy myself a new scarf, and it makes me happy. Do I say Shehecheyanu? Yeah. I buy myself some socks that I always wanted to get. Do I say Shehecheyanu? Yeah, right. Meaning, it's about me. It's about my feelings. I buy a thing that makes me happy, right? It's the gavra, it's on the person. Rabbi Yochanan saying, it doesn't matter if you've got a whole bunch more of these items. You buy it, you're joyful, say the blessing. Marvelous. Now here comes a twist. Because, as I'm sure you're aware, there are lots of commentaries on the Talmud. And perhaps the most notable is Rashi. The second most notable is Tosafot. Tosafot's actually a school of rabbis living in Germany and France, a little bit even in England, in the 12th to 14th centuries. And Tosafot, which we say in the plural, contains the views of different scholars. And Tosafot here tells us something, confirms what I said, that we rule like Rabbi Yochanan. Then throws us what they say in the States, a curveball, right? Sorry, you're Canadian. Do they have curveballs in America? Right. So, what does Tosafot say? This is source 3. It begins by saying the law is like Rabbi Yochanan, and in accordance with the latter remarks, even if you buy again after already having purchased the item, you say the bracha. Meaning, even if you already have a refrigerator and you buy another one, say the blessing, shkoyach. Now here's a curveball. He quotes the opinion of a Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shmuel, known as the Ri. It's an acronym, Rabbi Yitzchak, Ri. And Ri says something of quite unusual significance. He says, this is only true, I'm reading on the first page, source 3, I'll read it in Hebrew and in English. ואומר רי, דווקא בבגדים חשובים, דומיה דבית חדש, נקת כלים חדשים. He says, refer back to that Mishnah, the Mishnah which is on the board, right? The Mishnah says, if you build a new house and you buy new items, you say Shehecheyanu. So Ri says, the only items that are comparable to a house are nice items, are kelim chashuvim, important items. And therefore what he says is unimportant items, and he lists some. shoes, socks, undershirts do not deserve and should not invoke the recitation of Shehecheyanu. What we have here is something of significance. It's a halachic detail, but it's a significant shift in how we're viewing this blessing. According to the Mishnah, according to the Gemara, Shehecheyanu is about the person. You feel good, you say the blessing. The Ri says, just a minute. Yeah, I believe it's a little bit about that subjective feeling of joy. But he says, I think there's a measure of importance. And if the item doesn't make the cut, then you shouldn't say Shehecheyanu. If you buy a pair of socks, he says, you don't say the bracha. You buy an undershirt, not at all. You even buy a pair of shoes, he says, no Shehecheyanu. What are your thoughts about that? He's taken something which is very subjective, and he said, I believe there should be objective standards within this rule. Right? I'd say, do you like what he says? Seems a little bit strange, but what is your response? You're shaking off.
My response is no, I find shoes just as important as other things.
Right. Shoes are a big deal. But by the way, even if we took shoes out of the equation, because shoes have changed over the years, what he's kind of saying is, there are certain things which I'm telling you aren't important to you. And I understood the Gemara to say, sometimes what's important for one person is unimportant for another, and vice versa, right? So, in response to this, we have the ruling of the Rosh. Rosh is Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel. He selects, collates, and summarizes the law from the Gemara. He's living just a little bit after the Ri, and he says, let me tell you what I have to say about this. And this is one of the most fabulous sources you could ever read. I know for some people this is halachic detail. This is what gets me up in the morning. Because the Rosh says the following. This is source number 4. He says, Nir'eh l'Ri. He says, the Ri says, that davka b'kelim chashovim, that this law, the recitation of Shehecheyanu, should only be invoked when you're buying important items, like with the exception of all these other things. Remember the socks and the shoes and the cloak, whatever. Why? Because he argues that the Mishnah drew a comparison between building a house and buying new items, so the only items that deserve Shehecheyanu to be recited are ones which could be compared to building a new house. And now, what does he do? He says, B'yir'eh li. And what do I think? It appears to me, Hakol lefi ma shehu adam. Every situation should be determined by the person themselves. The yesh ani shesameach b'chaluk yater ma'ashir b'kelim chashavim. Because a poor person can be thrilled with a small cloak, whereas a rich person can be given a piece of jewelry and it means nothing to them. What the Rosh has said is, Mr. Ri, Rabbi Yitzchak, I fundamentally disagree with you. Shehecheyanu is not about measuring, it's about feelings. And sure, I get it, if it doesn't excite you, don't say the bracha. But don't tell me what excites me. Don't tell me what's important and what's not. Because poor person, a morsel of bread is going to get them excited. So the Rosh challenges the Ri. And he brings it back. And he says, this is a subjective bracha. Through and through. And don't try and inject these traces of objective standards that somebody or another is going to tell you what is and what isn't important. Now, the Rosh's son is called Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. And he writes what becomes really the foundation for the Shulchan Aruch. He writes the Arba Turim, literally the 4 columns. He arranges Jewish law in 4 categories, which becomes the basis of Shulchan Aruch. And what does Rabbi Yaakov say? What does the Baal Turim say? He says pretty much the same thing. If you look at source 5, He quotes the Mishnah, somebody who builds a house and da-da-da-da, and he quotes the Gemara. He talks about whether it needs to be new from new or not. In fact, he mentions the Yerushalmi that says this rule applies even if it's second hand. Because, if you buy something second hand and it's valuable to you, you're going to be happy. When I got a second hand piano, I said Shehecheyanu, right? Just because somebody else owned it didn't make me less happy.
But you could also say, that you were able to do these. You're thanking God.
Right, 100%. Here I'm dealing with specifically Shehecheyanu bracha. You're right. There are other things you could say to say thank you to God. My focus specifically is about Shehecheyanu. And the reason is because Shehecheyanu is discussed in the Mishnah. This is a very important blessing. It's a very ancient blessing. And I would say it is a very disregarded blessing, notwithstanding how old it is, how important it is. And we limit it to what we say on Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot and Shavuos. And I'm saying this is a huge blessing.
And when we eat new fruit every year, when it comes out like a new peach, the nectarines or whatever,
Yes, we say
out, you say the Shehecheyanu.
Say Shehecheyanu, right? But it's on Kelim Chadoshim, new things. It's on good news as well, right? And on mitzvahs. Now, what the Torah says is, not just I agree with my dad, he insists his dad is right. He says, number one, if you get a second-hand item and it's new to you, you say Shehecheyanu. What does that prove you? Shehecheyanu is about that person. And he says, my father said, the bracha is all about the simcha salev, the joy of the person. And he says, yeah, I know what Tosfos says. I know what the Ri says. I know that he's trying to introduce this measure of objective standards of what is and what isn't important. He says, but the bottom line is, everything should be according to the measure of joy of that individual. Job done. So, what we have here is, in the 12th, 13th centuries, a hot debate between the Ri and the Rosh and the Tur about whether there needs to be a measure of objective standards in defining when you should or shouldn't say Shehecheyanu. The Ri says yes. The Rosh and the Tur throw it out the window. They say thanks but no thanks. Now, what is the name of our Code of Jewish Law? What book do we go to know the bottom line halacha? Shulchan Aruch, right? So I've got my Shulchan Aruch here. So what does it say in the Shulchan Aruch? Let's have a look. Because you're going to see that something happened between the 14th and the mid-16th century in terms of Jewish practice, which has led to where we are today. If you do some detective work, you can sometimes figure out how come we are where we are as a Jewish world. Now, this is source number 6. The first part is exactly as you would expect. If you built a new house, bought new vessels, whether you had them already or didn't, just like the Mishnah, just like the Gemara, then you say Shehecheyanu. Job done. A few lines later in the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Reish Chaf Gimel, Sif Vav, it says, Adavar she'eino chashuv kol kach, things that aren't so important. Ring, 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 can you hear that bell? Who is influencing that perspective? The Ri, right? Kagoin chaluk manalim and palot, right? For example, like the undershirt and the shoes and your socks. Ein levarach aleihem. He paskins, you don't say the bracha. Seems to be that even though the Rosh disagree with the Ri and the Tur disagree with the Ri, the Shulchan Aruch is agreeing with the Ri. But then he saves it by the next line. He says, but if you're poor and you're happy, then you do it. What the Shulchan Aruch basically says is, I acknowledge the fact that there will be certain things which are less important you don't say Shehecheyanu on. But then he says, but I also acknowledge the fact that different people have different standards. Okay. So he's kind of like, he's nodded his head in recognition of the Ri's point, but he's saying, I don't agree with him. What's the next lines? The next lines are written by Rav Moshe Isserles in Krakow in the 16th century. And the Ramah in Krakow in the 16th century then says, Hagor, gloss, v'yesh omrim, and there are those who say, Dafilu oni she'eina mavarech al chaluk u'manalim v'kadome v'chein nagim. The Ramah basically says, a poor person, even if they're thrilled beyond belief for their shirt or their shoes or their socks or whatever, the custom is that they don't say a bracha, and that's what we do. In 1.5 lines, what the Ramah basically says is, he's not saying the Ri is right. He's saying for some reason or another, between the 12th century and the 16th century, it's come to a reality that poor people have got into their head that things that are less important shouldn't be said, shouldn't have Shehecheyanu recited on them, even if they're happy. And so they didn't say it. And what the Ramah basically is doing is recording custom. So he's saying, the Machaber of Yosef Karo may well be right. Principally, if a poor person is joyous, he should say the bracha. He said, practically we don't. And what we see in this text is that Jewish people living in Israel or in Europe kind of said, maybe in the 13th or 14th or 15th centuries, kind of started saying, whether the Ri's right or wrong, maybe those socks aren't really that important. Maybe those shoes really aren't such a big deal. We allowed the notion of objective standards to influence our practice of Shehecheyanu. Not the law didn't change, but the practice of the law changed. And the practice of the law is what's being recorded by the Ramah. And the Ramah basically says, whether or not we paskin like the Ri, we live like the Ri. And a distinction starts to be drawn between things which are important and things which are not. Such that you can have a poor person who gets something that really makes them happy, and society, the common practice was, no, we don't say bracha for things like this. If you've understood what I've said so far, that's really quite shocking. Nobody's done anything deliberately malicious. But what we've seen is an erosion of and a disconnection from a core principle of the Shehecheyanu bracha. That even though the law, as made very clear by the Rosh, as made very clear by the Torah, as made very clear even by the Shulchan Aruch, is subjective feelings matter. And sure, what you may well say is important, I may not. But I can say the bracha if it makes me happy. And if I'm a poor person, even an unimportant item in your eyes deserves Shehecheyanu, the practice ceased. What would I attribute that to? Well, I would say we as a Jewish people like to be led. And over time, around about this time, maybe a little bit beforehand, we get quite anxious when we have to make decisions on our own. You see, all of Judaism is kind of prescribed for us. We're told when to fast. We're told what to do. Shehecheyanu is one of the rarest of areas in Judaism, in which we're told, if you feel it, do it. If you don't, don't. And I think as a Jewish people, we didn't quite know how to handle that autonomy, that freedom, that subjectivity. I mean, it sounds strange, but it's actually what's happened. The average Jew in Poland in the 16th century is kind of saying, I don't know whether they're going to think that I'm so happy or not, whether this is important. You know what, I'm not going to say it. And when you don't do things for hundreds of years, that becomes a custom. Even if the custom is not rooted in the reasoning of the majority of thinkers. I accept that the Ri said this, but I also accept that the Rosh and the Torah and others said different. And by the way, that may have been the Ashkenazim. I happen to be Sephardi. You should know that spread to Sephardi communities as well. So let me show you source 7. Source 7 is basically common day Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It was written by the Sephardi chief rabbi of Tel Aviv called Chaim David Halevi. This is a standard code of law that's used in schools across the country. Okay? It's like a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch written about 50 years ago. What does Rabbi Chaim David Halevi say as a law for everybody? He's written this as a code book for Israel and for all Jews everywhere. He's saying, source number 7, on an item that's not so important, such as an undershirt or shoes, one should not say a blessing. And even a poor person shouldn't say a blessing. Meaning, from the time of the Ramah of Moshe Isserles in the mid-16th century onwards, we allowed to creep in, through common custom, the notion, the idea, the principle that Shehecheyanu is measurable. Now, isn't that a thing? The blessing that was all about personal feelings. That, remember, the Lashon HaRosh, the wording of the Rosh, is all about Simchas HaLev, right? The idea that if you're happy and you know it, say the blessing, yeah? Measurability became an important thing. I would say part of it is to do with, say, that lack of confidence about autonomy, about making our own decisions. I'd say another thing is books. We're going to get to that in a second. You see, books aren't very good at telling us to do our own thing. Books are all about telling us what the rule is, right? And from the 16th century onwards, the publishing industry, we've become more and more reliant on guidebooks and code books. And guidebooks and code books don't generally say, if you feel it, go for it. And let me show you how far this goes. Because I've shown you the debate from the Mishnah, which is 2,000 years old, and the Gemara, which is 1,500 years old, and Tosfos, which is 800 years old, and the Rosh, and 700, and the Torah, 600, and Shulchan Aruch, which is 500. And I've skipped a whole bunch, but all of them said the same thing. I'm just doing this for the sake of brevity and clarity. A few years back, I went to a Jewish bookstore in Israel. And I said, I'm interested in Shehecheyanu. I bought a couple of books. Some very large, weighty Hebrew volumes, and this one. It's an English book, Something New, a comprehensive guide to the halachos of Shehecheyanu. I want to make this something clear. I have no beef against the author whatsoever, but I'm using his book as an example of everything wrong about halacha. Okay? So, I'm using him as a example of how far this goes. And I've copied a page from this book. It's over here in your handout, source number 8. And what does it tell me? If you followed what I've said until now, you'll be blown away by this table. Because this table basically tells me when I'm allowed to be happy. Look carefully. If you buy a coat, apparently you're happy enough to buy Shehecheyanu. But if you buy a head covering, Shaitel Tichel, you're definitely not. It seems very certain about how I'm going to feel, right? If you buy a leather belt, that's not good enough. Pants, by the way, pants, of course, in American, trousers, no. A scarf, no. Shoes, no. Sweater, no. Tallis cotton, undershirt. Meaning, what this book tells me, what this table represents, is the contemporary definition of the attempt to measure feelings. I look back at the Rosh and the Torah, which says, if you buy something that makes you happy, say the bracha. I look at this book, and it tells me, unless the book tells me I'm happy, I don't get to say it. Are you following me?
So a men's suit isn't even listed.
Right, well, again, I want to stress, this book is just, it's an example of many other works. The author himself collated it based on other writings, but what we see is a trend from the autonomy and the subjectivity expressed by the ability to say Shehecheyanu, if you buy something that makes you happy, to a stage today which says, even a poor person, they get something they want, they need, they don't say the bracha. And this table tells me you buy something, you're thrilled with this sweater, right? You're delighted with the belt that you were wishing to buy for years on end. The head covering, the shaitel, you've been dreaming for this for decades. But apparently, you're not supposed to say the Shehecheyanu. This tramples on the very principles that the Rosh and the Torah stood for. You hear me? And by the way, I'm using this as a framing device to so many other areas of contemporary orthodoxy. So what we've become really good at is measuring stuff. But it comes at a profound cost. The profound cost of being aligned with your inner self, your inner voice, your subjective feelings. Being prepared to recognize that if I feel good about a moment religiously, and a Mishnah, we're not talking about some random minor text, or a Gemara tells me I not just can say the bracha, perhaps even I should. And where are we today? Almost 5, 7, 7, 8. We have tables to tell us what does provide you with simchas halev and which doesn't. If you turn the page, you'll encounter two sources. One is most certainly the most eloquent examination of this phenomenon, written in 1994, an essay by Chaim Soloveitchik called Rupture and Reconstruction. If you've yet to read it, you can Google it. You can download the whole article. It's a brilliant essay. And what this brilliant essay tells us is, especially in the last 100 years, we've become obsessed by measuring things. And we've gone from what he describes as a mimetic tradition, where you do what your parents did because you saw them doing it, to a textual tradition. You do what the book says, even if your parents were doing something valid. Of course, part of it's related to the loss of people, the Shoah, but it's not all. As Chaim Soloveitchik says, I come from pretty good yichus, the Soloveitchik family, and yet people will tell me that what I'm doing is wrong because I can't find a book to defend it. And you say, trust me, my great-grandfather was pretty frum. As he explains, if I were to characterize, if I were asked to characterize in a phrase a change that religious Jewry has undergone in the past generation, I would say that it was a new and controlling role that texts now play in contemporary religious life. And in saying that, I open myself to an obvious question. What is new in this role? Has not traditional Jewish society always been regulated by the normative written word, the halakha? Have not scholars for over the millennium pored over the Talmud and its codes, etc.? Is not the Jewish religiosity proudly legalistic, etc.? And he goes on to say, of course, the answer is yes. However, as the halakha is a sweepingly comprehensive regular of daily life covering, not only prayer and divine service, but equally food, drink, dress, sexual relations between man and wife, and the rhythms of work and patterns of rest, it constitutes a way of life. And a way of life is not learned, but rather absorbed. Its transmission is mimetic, imbibed from parents and friends, and patterned on conduct regularly observed in home and street and synagogue and school. What we have here is one of the most powerful expressions of a trend which he saw for the last 100 years, but in Shehecheyanu we've seen for the last 500 years. Where he had a bracha which is exquisite, which is powerful, which is deeply moving, which should be being said in so many different contexts, which we've narrowed it and limited it and then started to measure it, such that even a poor person getting the thing they need apparently shouldn't be saying the bracha. Now, I mentioned Rabbi Chaim David Halevi as being the author of Makor Chaim Shalem, as I say, really what is a kind of a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch textbook used in schools in Israel. But he also wrote response. He answered questions that people asked him. And somebody wrote him a question in Tafshin Mem Vav, which is, I think, 1984, or 1986, and they said to him, Dear Rabbi Halevi, I've noticed in your book, your ruling. Do you remember the ruling we saw earlier on that says even a poor person, they get what they want, they don't say Shehecheyanu, because nowadays a custom is all about what's important and what's not. And the author said, it doesn't make sense. Because this author, a bit like me, clearly was very passionate about Shehecheyanu. And they'd learnt the Mishnah, they'd learnt the Gemara, they'd learnt the Rosh, and they'd learnt the Torah, and they'd learnt the Shulchan Aruch. And they said, just because the custom has become that way in certain places doesn't mean that's what we should be doing. So he said, if I get an item that makes me happy, surely I should say Shehecheyanu. You have this part of the response in source number 10. Rabbi Halevi responds, he says, thank you for your letter that I received on this date. He says, sorry for my delay in responding, I was a little bit tied up. He said, in response to the question about whether we should say Shehecheyanu on the purchase or receipt of new clothing, and the questioner quoted the Makor Chaim Shalem and challenged him, and he said, what should I do if somebody gives me this kind of an item? If it makes me happy, you're implying I shouldn't be saying the bracha, but from everything I know about Shehecheyanu, I should. If you zoom to the bit where it's a little bit bold towards the end, he says, after a lengthy examination, you're right. You're right, I slipped up. Not that I was wrong, I call this what we call auto-codification. Rabbi Halevi kind of said, I was writing what other people were writing. And I've come to realize that what they were writing was wrong. Not fundamentally wrong that they're encouraging, heinous crimes, but wrong philosophically. Meaning we've gotten so used to doing it in that measured, objective way, we've forgotten the tradition. We've become so reliant on books, we've forgotten what people used to do. And he writes and says, truth be told, and by the way, I'm a big fan of Rabbi Halevi, but this makes me even a greater fan, because somebody who writes something and then is called out on it and says, he goes through the whole sugya and he says, you're right. He says, right? He says, anybody who purchases himself any kind of piece of clothing, and is genuinely joyful, and wants to say Shehecheyanu, go for it. He goes on to add, there's actually a debate. You know, we sometimes say, if you're not sure if you say a bracha, you shouldn't. There's a machloket as to whether that rule applies with Shehecheyanu. And by the way, if you've understood what I've been saying, that machloket makes sense. Some people look at Shehecheyanu as being a bit like a mitzvah thing. So if you're not sure, you wouldn't say it. But if you understand Shehecheyanu as a subjective thing, there's never a safek, there's never a doubt. If you're not feeling it, you don't say it. If you are feeling it, you do say it. There's never a should you or should you not in that second category of birkat hoda'ah. If you're feeling elated, then you are duty bound to say it. If you're not, you're not. And there'll never be a grey area, right? So he goes on to say, don't think that there's going to be a problem in you saying this blessing of a safek bracha, of a doubtful blessing. He says that doesn't apply to Shehecheyanu. He notes, some people say it does, but he's quite clear that it doesn't. And he ends off by echoing the words of the Rosh, and by echoing the words of the Tur written all those years ago. He says, he says, I think what I've written is correct. And somebody says Shehecheyanu based on the joy of their heart. Mitzvah, they're doing a mitzvah. Because fundamentally, you're right. Shehecheyanu is about those subjective feelings, about the simchat halev, about the joy of the heart. And no person can tell me how I'm feeling. No person has the right or the capabilities to measure for me whether I'm joyful or not. Yeah, we know the Re took that approach, but we also know that the majority of other voices took a different one. Meaning, it's not to say that opinion is irrelevant, but it is to say it's marginal. And for a marginal opinion to really take Shehecheyanu and reduce it, dilute it, almost erase it out from our purchasing life, our living life, our social life, is to do tremendous harm. Got 1 more minute. So let me summarize and then I'll take any questions. Hopefully, through this past 50 or so minutes, you've got an idea of why I love this bracha. In this course, we're going to learn the halachas of Shehecheyanu. We've spoken about halachas very clearly. When do you say it? How you say it? Where there's debates. What you also see here is a wonderful prism, a fabulous and fascinating framing device for contemporary debates in Orthodoxy. What is the role of subjectivity in Orthodoxy? In many areas, there's no role, right? You have to do what you're supposed to do. You can't say, I want to keep Yom Kippur tomorrow because I don't want to do it in 3 weeks' time. You don't get that choice. There are some areas of Judaism which it is about that person's feelings, which it is about that person's experience. And I think, quite sincerely, that what we've done is we have, sadly, paid limited attention, if no attention, to the role of the individual experience. And if we took Shehecheyanu seriously, Kedat B'Kedin, as mentioned in the Mishnah and the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, exactly as is. I'm not trying to be a revolutionary. I'm trying to learn Torah and live a Torah lifestyle. But number one, Shehecheyanu should be said in malls and in homes a lot more regularly. We should be citing, expressing, acknowledging and celebrating God's presence in our lives. Number two, we know that our feelings matter. Not in every area, but in some areas. And that creates those magical moments of union between ourselves and our Creator. And the fact that we don't do that, and that we've converged towards an orthodox lifestyle in which I rely on a book such as this, again I'm just using it as an example, to inform me how I should feel, takes a bit of me away. It undermines my individuality. That's where many Jews are struggling. We've become so book-centric, and you should know my house is heaving with books. But books are part of our life, but they're not the only part of our life. It's about our awareness, our sensibility, our reflectiveness. So that's our first session on Shehecheyanu. I hope you've enjoyed it. Any questions, please let me know. But I think you now have an idea of the kind of direction and methodology we're going to adopt. And I hope it's been fun for you, because it's been fun for me.